So for example, an argument would be, well, Greg, you're on HRT, so you don't need to bulk and cut. But if I'm doing it natural, I need to bulk and cut. Do you think there's a difference between natties and enhanced in terms of the need to bulk and cut?
I would argue the exact opposite, because
Coach Greg, and I'm here with Scientific Snitch, and she goes by the name of Ella, and her channel is exploding in popularity. This girl had like 50,000 followers about a month ago. She's almost at 90,000, and so she's going to the moon. I'm telling you guys, in a year or two, she's going to have 1 million followers, and so I highly recommend you follow her channel. And so welcome.
Thank you, Greg. It's really great to be on the channel. So yeah, I work in a lab. I do coaching. I like everything to do with science.
And what's shocking to me is I've watched your content. I'm a fan. You're very educated, but I come to find out you're only 22 years of age. How is it possible that you know so much about training, nutrition, everything at such a young age?
I kind of started a little earlier when I first learned how to read studies. And after I learned how to read studies, I just started reading like a study every weekend. And it was something that became a hobby of mine, and I would make TikTok videos on the studies I read. They eventually popped off. And since then, I've just kind of upgraded my knowledge and talked to other professionals who are on online platforms. And I feel like there's always something to say, that everybody has a piece of knowledge that you don't have. So if you learn what that is, then you're going to make yourself a smarter person at the end of the day.
And I think what I really like about your videos is that you give the science behind what people actually think. So for example, you'll mention Jeff Nippert or Paul Saladino or Eddie Abu or all these guys who might say something, and you're like, this is what the actual science says. And then we can have a debate. It's nothing against the person. It's just, this is what the science is saying. And you report it in a very concise manner, about 1 minute in length.
As far as like the science goes, I feel like there's a very big emphasis on one point in many different influencers, where they'll grasp on to this one idea and they won't let go of it for the life of them. And it's really important to acknowledge that new science comes out every year or so. So even I might be wrong in maybe a year or so, but it's just about like making sure to look at the more broader range of the information that's out there, rather than just focusing and hyperfixating on that one point and never budging from it. It's always important to be skeptical. And I feel like that's what needs to be added to the discussion when it comes to fitness and health.
Very good point. With new science, new opinions comes out and things change. And so we see that with new supplements coming in all the time. But another thing that we've seen is the topic of main gaining. It's come and gone. Today, I think that bulking is vaulted, or it's basically bullshit at this point, that we don't need to bulk and cut, which I'm going to say 95% of people think you need to bulk and then cut in order to put on muscle, that's the optimal way to do it. I've seen some of your videos, and so let's have a little discussion. Do you need to bulk and cut to put on muscle optimally? Or could you, for example, maintain a healthy body fat percentage, which I say is, for example, for men, let's call it 15%, for women, 25%, and just slowly put on muscle over time? Or should we bulk up to perhaps 10 or 20 pounds, get on a bit more fat, get a bit more sloppy, and then diet down? And will that be, in fact, better based on the studies that you've seen?
Based on the studies I've seen, that bulking and cutting is not supported by the literature, at least to the extent that people think. A lot of people will cite these short, and I say short term because this is the longest study we'll ever have on this topic, but short term or quote unquote long-term outcome studies in people who are trained in bulking. But the issue is that they never compare it to actually doing like a main gaining sort of thing that you preached. And honestly, it makes a lot more sense to do that than bulking up and gaining body fat. Because if you want to think about it like this, if you're gaining body fat, those calories aren't going towards your muscle, they're going towards body fat. And if you're just storing body fat over time, you're eventually going to have to cut back down. And when you do, then you're taking calories away from carbs, which depletes you of glycogen. You're taking calories away from protein, which takes away one of the main signals of muscle hypertrophy. Or you're taking away fats, which can have a bad impact on your mood and your overall mental health. So it's a mixture of you have to take something away at a certain point, alongside the fact that if you're putting on body fat, it's not muscle. Like you can't just force body fat to turn to muscle. And if we can build muscle in a deficit, then we can build muscle at maintenance.
Yeah, the trouble I had with that was always like, I could see how eating in a calorie surplus, more calories, force feeding perhaps, would build a little bit more muscle. I could get behind that. Okay, I'm like, okay, that makes sense, like logically. But then you're fatter and now you have to go on a diet. And so now you're in a deficit. And so while I'm maintaining and eating what I need, you're now in a cut. And so how could you possibly build as much muscle while you're dieting? And so I feel like both methods in the end are going to result in the exact same amount of muscle built over, say, a year, 2 years, or 5 or 10 years.
That's 100% what I basically preach. And a big reason, and I actually also, even though I do feel like there is a potential to build more muscle on a bulk, I don't think that the way that a lot of people do bulk when they first start getting into the gym is going to be conducive of that extra muscle. Specifically when we're talking about like getting fatter, if you're coming from a place where you're very small, going and bulking to an extent that you are at a higher body fat percentage, you are increasing the amount of fat cells that you have, because that is one of the primary like starting points of body fat gain. So it's you're almost stepping on your own foot when you want to get leaner. And I don't think that newbies should be bulking until they're like overweight and obese.
Very interesting point. Now, remember, I'm old. I'm 49. I'm pushing 50. Pushing 50 keys of testosterone across the border. But that's besides the point. When I was 22, when I was your age, you weren't even born yet. And we learned that there was 3 times in your life where fat cells could divide. This is what I was taught. When during pregnancy, when you're a baby, or during puberty. That was the only time that fat cells could actually divide and multiply. But what I'm hearing is that new science is saying that when you go on a bulk, the fat cells, the billions or however many you have, some of them are dividing and they're there permanently. And so if you bulk and cut, every time you go about this, you're actually having more fat cells. And so it's even going to be harder to stay lean over time.
Yeah. So basically, the entire idea behind that, we have about 300 different overfeeding studies, and you can see this in the systematic review. And I can send over the link too if you want to like pull it up or whatnot. But there's been over 300 overfeeding studies over the past some odd years. I don't even remember how long, but it's a lot of studies. And what we've seen is in healthy young individuals who eat and overeat in a caloric surplus, they start gaining fat cells first. And this makes sense from just like a survival and evolutionary perspective, where if we were out in the wild and we were faced with a surplus, wouldn't it be better to have more fat storage? So that way, when you do cut back down, you have that essential body fat that you need because you have more energy stores. So typically when you start overfeeding, fat cell division is the first step. And then from there, they hypertrophy. And although the fat cell division is not the problem, the hypertrophy part is. So if you want to think about it like this, if your fat cells are dividing, that's not going to be a huge deal for you in the short term. But in the long term, when those fat cells hypertrophy, that's when they're going to start sending those, metabolic dysregulation signals, which are not conducive of being able to diet down.
And so from an evolutionary perspective, this seems to make sense because a lot of people think that we're like, it's 2024, you can identify for whatever you want and so on. But we got to think 10,000 or 100,000 years ago, we didn't have what we have right now. And so if you were being faced with starvation in the winters, and every time you had to go through that, if your fat cells divided and became more plentiful and it made it easier to get fat, that would actually be a good thing. 2024, being fat, obese, this is not good. But thousands of years ago, it probably was. And so from an evolutionary adaptive thought process, it makes sense that that's how our bodies would work.
Yeah, it does. And even though I'm not very big on the whole like ancestral, like look at what our ancestors did. Like I'm not all into that sort of thing, mainly because there's not a lot of evidence that can go to back that up. But what we do have is those overfeeding studies. And those overfeeding studies make sense from an evolutionary perspective. They also go to show like you in histology, you literally see in these healthy individuals who are overfed more fat cells. And in fact, some of their fat cells actually shrunk in size, like the average size of the fat cell shrunk because there were more. So it wouldn't make any sense if fat cell hypertrophy was the primary driver of fat gain, which is, I found it kind of interesting.
And so are there any studies at all that say if you keep dieting, that maybe your fat cells stay smaller, easier, longer, or that they disappear, and that the more times you diet, the easier it is to stay shredded? Or is that just silly to think?
I would think that the more times you stay lean, like the more, like the length of time that you stay lean, probably will have a bigger impact on how easy it is to stay lean rather than cycling. We know that weight cycling is inherently bad for us. We know that that can drive up insulin resistance because as fat cells hypertrophy, that's when that insulin resistance kind of comes on. And we also see that in overfeeding studies where individuals who gain weight and then lose weight, they tend to have a poor amount of insulin sensitivity where they're weight cycling. However, with that being said, I don't think that staying lean is inherently bad. It just would be inherently bad for building muscle because you just don't have as much body fat on you to play around with.
And so I think with main gaining, I think that the pushback is that a lot of people are saying main gaining doesn't work, or guys who are, I don't know if you know, like Tristan Lee, guys like single digit body fat that are very lean all the time, and they have a harder time putting on muscle, but that's because they're not eating enough in the first place. If you get to that healthy weight, that main gaining is all you need to do. But if you're perpetually competing, like you're a bodybuilder like C-Bum or any Mr. Olympia competitor, of course you're going to bulk and cut. You're at 5% body fat. You might bulk to 12 to 15, then you cut back to 5. But if you're a normal human being, you're probably already fat. Most people are fat to start with. And so why are you going on a bulk if you've already bulked? If you're walking around and you're at 25% body fat right now, why are you actually adding more calories? You already have more than you need.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. And I feel like a lot of people push back because they don't actually understand what maintenance means. I get a lot of people saying that maintenance calories is just maintaining your body weight. But the issue with that is that it's not just body fat and muscle. You have water weight, you have glycogen stores, and you can only fill your glycogen stores to a certain extent before they're kind of capped out. And that's why we build body fat when we bulk, because it's not going towards our glycogen at that point. It's just going towards body fat. With that being said, being somebody who's extremely lean and then trying to gain probably isn't going to work too well for you. Especially if you're such a low body fat percentage. I see why bodybuilders have to do it, but even they are not necessarily doing the bulk and cut cycle because they're not bulking to an absurd extent. Like especially if you're talking about somebody as competitive as C-Bum, I can almost guarantee he's not bulking to obesity and then coming back down.
No, he's probably 12% maximum. And all these other, like Mr. Olympia, like Derek Lunsford, he won last year's Mr. Olympia. Off season, 10% max. These guys are shredded year round, but then people will say, yeah, but they're on steroids. So do you think there's a big difference between like natural versus enhanced? So for example, an argument would be, well, Greg, you're on HRT, so you don't need to bulk and cut. But if I'm doing it natural, I need to bulk and cut. Do you think there's a difference between natties and enhanced in terms of the need to bulk and cut?
I would argue the exact opposite, because people who are on androgenic compounds, they tend to grow faster. They have an extra. So if you want to think about it, like if my pinky finger is the pathway for recovery, this is like the pathway for steroids and androgenic compounds, where they're kind of overlapping each other. But instead of having like damage and an injury to start off with the recovery pathway, you have steroids, which at the very end of the day end up in more growth. So you're not just replacing what you lost, but you're growing on top of what you already have. So you're hijacking something that normally would just keep you the same size, but using it for growth. People who are on anabolics, they're more likely to grow faster, and it just does not make any sense. Why would you say that it would work less for naturals if that's the case?
Okay, I like this. And so for people like, what I'm hearing is if you're natural, the argument should be definitely main gaining is going to work. But if you're enhanced, maybe bulking cutting would benefit you because you're building muscle perhaps 10 times faster and you need all those extra calories.
I wouldn't argue necessarily bulking and cutting. I would say that it would just be a different type of main gaining. So like when we're talking about main gaining, we're increasing calories in proportion to how much muscle we're gaining. So to them, maybe it seems like a bulk because they're increasing those calories so quickly. But in reality, their body fat percentage is still staying the same. Like the same sort of pathways and mechanisms are going to work for people who are on anabolics versus natural. It's just one is going to be a little faster. So you're just increasing that rate, that increased calorie amount a little bit faster. But with that being said, as I said before, maintenance calories does not necessarily equal maintenance of just body weight. It's more so maintenance of body fat, because that's what we store and use when we eat too much or we eat too little.
Bulking is vaulted. Do you agree with this? Don't
Yeah.
need to bulk. All
Yeah,
right.
I don't need a bulk.